Hello, my name is Trinium, and this is WikiReads. Now, if many of you are like me, you're very busy with daily life and often do not have time to read, let alone delve into the near endless treasure trove of written content that is Wikipedia. However, if, like me, you find enjoyment in listening to audio form content and find it to be a better medium for learning, that's basically where WikiReads comes in. The idea is we take pages from Wikipedia, read them, and all you have to do is just sit back and listen. For the time being, of course, I'm going to start with clicking on random articles and we'll just go through and read. Depending on how long they are, it might be 2 or 3 per video. I hope to be able to grow this series and channel where I'll be able to take suggestions down the road on what to actually read. I do not know if this will be the only form of content I do on this channel, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, sit back, put this on in the background, and enjoy. Letham F.C. Letham Football Club are a Scottish football club from the Letham area in northwest of Perth. They are members of the East Region of the Scottish Junior Football Association and currently play in the Midlands Football League. History: Letham were formed in 1960 as an amateur club playing in the Perthshire Amateur Football Association. They joined the Scottish Junior Football Association in 2021. Their home ground is 7 acres. The club has a long-standing history in youth football and currently runs around 20 teams in various age groups. Their full name, Letham Football Club. Nickname, Tangerines. Founded in 1960. Ground 7 acres, Letham, Perth, and Kinross, Scotland. Capacity 300. League, Midlands Premier League. A World of Hurt. A World of Hurt is a science fiction novel by American writers David Sherman and David Cragg, the 10th novel in their Starfist series. Plot summary: a civilian analyst in the Confederation of Human Worlds Development Control Division of the Department of Colonial Development, Population Control, and Xenobiological Studies notices a peculiar series of incidents on the colony world of Malgham's Station and flags it as having possible military interest. The military does find it of interest. It looks like the work of skinks, the alien race responsible for an invasion of the planet Kingdom, described in the earlier novels Kingdom's Sword and Kingdom's Fury. The 34th Fleet Initial Strike Team, FIST, is dispatched to investigate the situation on Malgham's Station and, if necessary, drive the skinks from the planet. Soon the 34th Fist soon finds that the supposed skinks-related attacks are in fact aggressive botanical life that uses natural weapons having an uncanny resemblance to the acid guns of the skinks. In other goings-on, the Space Navy of the planet We're Here have discovered a surreptitious mining operation taking place on the planet in a neighboring star system, one that they have a claim on. The commander of We're Here's Navy is delighted to have a chance to make war, and he acts without notifying the civilian government. Reception: the novel was mostly well received. Publishers Weekly said, for instance, that you don't have to be a military SF buff to appreciate this entertaining and instructive exercise. Roland Green, writing for Booklist, meanwhile, said it was, in its own way, intelligent and agreeable. Cassida Jackie, writing for the Library Journal, highlighted its familiar characters and catchy dialogue. Jessica Anderson, writer. Not to be confused with Jessica Anderson, writer. That one is with an E. The one we are currently reading is with an O. Jessica Margaret Anderson. Born in Gayndah, Anderson lived the bulk of her life in Sydney, apart from a few years in London. She began her career writing short stories for newspapers and drama scripts for radio. especially adaptations of well-known novels. Embarking on her career as a novelist relatively late in her life, her first novel was published when she was 47. Her early novels attracted little attention. She rose to prominence upon the publication of her fourth novel, Tira Lira by the River, published in 1978. Although she remains best known for this work, several of her novels have garnered high acclaim, most notably The Impersonators in 1980, and Stories from the Warm Zone and Sydney Stories in 1987. She won the Miles Franklin Literary Award twice and has been published in Britain and the United States. Jessica Anderson died at Elizabeth Bay, New South Wales in 2010 following a stroke. She was the mother of Australian screenwriter Laura Jones, her only child. Early life. Jessica Anderson was born Jessica Margaret Quayle in Gynda, Queensland on 25th of September 1916 to Charles James Quayle and Alice Quayle. Anderson's father, Charles Quayle, born 1867, died 1933, was the youngest child of a large Irish family and the only one to be born in Australia. Upon their arrival in Queensland, the Quayleys set up residence in Gynda in a house to which Anderson fleetingly refers to in Stories from the Warm Zone and Sydney Stories as the Old Barn. Coming from a family of farmers, Charles Quayle acquired a veterinarian certificate and took up a position in the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Stock. Anderson's mother, Alice Quayle, was born in England and emigrated to the Queensland with her family at the age of 3. The daughter of a Church of England music teacher, she had learned the violin as a child and sometimes played for her family as an adult. Before marrying, Alice worked in the public service and joined the Queensland Labour Movement, in which she met Anderson's father, Charles. Staunch Anglicans, Alice's family disapproved of her marriage to Charles, and for the rest of her life, Alice's mother refused to see Charles or any of Alice's children. Jessica was the youngest of 4 children. Her elder siblings were Alan Lindsay Quayle, 1908 to 1982, Vita Joan Quayle, 1910 to 1954, and Patricia Quayle. While each features to some extent in her semi-autobiographical work, Stories from the Warm Zone and Sydney Stories, Anderson's relationship with her brother, Alan, Neil in the memoirs, who was 8 years her senior, is the least developed in the collection. Indeed, Anderson stated in one interview that for many years she and her brother lived in different channels of the same family, and that it was only during the later years of his life, when they were the last surviving members of the immediate family, that they grew close. Alan Quayle rose to some renown in his own right as a prolific archivist, mostly of Australiana and artifacts of Queensland's history, and many of his collections remain in the State Library of Queensland and the National Library of Australia. Beyond the brief glimpses afforded by Stories from the Warm Zone and Sydney Stories, little is known about Anderson's relationship with her 2 sisters, Joan and Patricia. Her eldest sister, Joan, died in her early 40s when Anderson was in the 30s, tragically leaving behind several young children. Her other sister, Patricia, also died of cancer some years later. Anderson writes very affectionately of her sisters. For the benefit of their children's schooling, the Quayle family moved from Gynda to the Brisbane suburb in Annerley when Anderson was 5 years old. Anderson's father, Charles, somewhat begrudgingly left his father's meager acres and took up a job in an office in Brisbane's CBD, from which he instructed others how to farm, how to treat disease in stock and crops, but still longed to return to farming himself. For the remainder of Anderson's childhood, the Quayleys lived at 56 Villa Street in a house abutting Yeronga Memorial Park. On the opposite side of the park was Yeronga State School, the school at which Anderson began her formal education. In spite of its reputation as one of the best state schools in Queensland at the time, Yeronga State School rapidly became a site of dread and frustration for Anderson, who suffered from a speech impediment that caused strife for her in the classroom. Anderson's speech impediment, as well as her occasional flirtations with truancy, became such a hindrance to her education that her parents decided that she was to be homeschooled by her mother for a year. While attending weekly speech therapy sessions in the city, in spite of these efforts, Anderson's slight stammer was to stay with her for the rest of her life. Several observers commented that the impediment lent her speech a careful and deliberate air. Following her primary school education, Anderson attended high school at Brisbane State High School. Upon graduation, she attended Brisbane Technical College Art School. Anderson's father died when she was just 16. Suffering from chronic bronchitis and emphysema, and having survived diphtheria and typhoid fever, her father's illness is a pall that hangs over many of the tales and stories from the Warm Zone, and his death was undoubtedly a bitter blow to the young girl and her siblings. Anderson appeared to have a complicated relationship with Brisbane, a city where brutality and gentleness rested so easily side by side. Although she believed 1920s Brisbane to be quite parochial, she stated that it was not altogether narrow and rigid. She took the well-thumbed copies of the great Russian novels in Brisbane's public libraries as evidence of the presence of many frustrated people in Brisbane, people with aspiration beyond their society. Herself a victim of the stifling social expectations of the old colonial town, she was stated that she would have liked to be an architect, but it seemed at the time absolutely impossible for a girl to be an architect, especially in Brisbane. Life as a commercial writer. In 1935, at the age of 18, Anderson left her Brisbane home to live in Sydney. Despite the fact that she spent her childhood in Queensland, she stated in interviews that she felt more affinity with Sydney, the city where she was to spend the bulk of her adult life. There, she subsisted on wages from a number of sources, including a slide painting job and a job designing electric signs, where she was able to make use of her art school training and later from work in shops and factories. She and her friends lived at Potts Point in big, seedy, decaying mansions with gardens running right down to the harbor. In a city still recovering from the ravages of the Great Depression, life for Anderson was not altogether easy. Times were very hard, she recalled. People were poor, but very free. We had a good life. As Anderson remained throughout her life evasive about the details of her life as a commercial writer, it is not known when she began writing commercially under pseudonyms, what those pseudonyms were, or indeed how much she wrote. She revealed only that she began writing for magazines and newspapers out of commercial necessity and rarely under her own name. Although she achieved success later in this field, she sometimes stated that as her writing improved, her pieces were more frequently turned down for publication. In her 30s, she began to write for commercial radio, beginning with half-hour slots. Anderson gradually became interested in the technique of crafting radio plays and began submitting some of her better work to the ABC under her own name. She later ascribed her fondness for writing with expansive dialogue in her novels to her early experience writing radio plays. It was in Sydney that Anderson met her first husband, Ross McGill, with whom she lived for 3 years before their marriage in 1940. Anderson described McGill as a commercial artist who longed to be a painter. Tragically, nearly all of his works were destroyed in a fire, and Anderson was left with only a few drawings of his that he had given to a mutual friend who then generously shared them with Anderson. Anderson and McGill temporarily relocated to London in 1937. There, Anderson found employment that she described as donkey work. She did research for a magazine named Townsman and worked as a typist. Meanwhile, her husband, McGill, worked as a layout artist for Lever Brothers agency, while continuing to paint in his spare time. While some critics have preferred this stint in England as evidence of the semi-autobiographical nature of Tira Lira by the River, Anderson rejected such claims, asserting that while all of her characters had something of her in them, none were entirely autobiographical. In 1940, Anderson and McGill returned to Sydney. During the war, Anderson worked as a seasonal fruit picker in the Australian Women's Land Army. She gave birth to her only child, Laura Jones, in 1946. Jones now works as a film and television screenwriter in Australia. First, novels. After 14 years of marriage, Anderson and McGill divorced, and she married Leonard Culber Anderson. in 1955. More comfortable financial circumstances following her second marriage allowed her to fulfill her lifelong intention to write a novel, An Ordinary Lunacy. She began work on her first novel, An Ordinary Lunacy, relatively late in life. She started writing in her late 30s, and it was published only in 1963, by which time she was aged 47. Although it began life as a radio play, Anderson quickly found that An Ordinary Lunacy was interesting enough for a novel, so I went off, and it got quite out of hand. The novel detailed the romance between 35-year-old Sydney barrister David Byfield and Isabel Purdy, a woman accused of murdering her husband. Acclaimed for its adept portrayal of the protein nature of romantic love, An Ordinary Lunacy foregrounds the different perspectives of three women: Isabel, Daisy Byfield, David's mother, and Myra Magaskill, David's ex-lover. Pam Gilbert writes that Anderson's construction of the tensions existing between three women such as Daisy, Isabel, and Myra offers an interesting platform for an exposition of romance and passion from a woman's perspective. Upon completion of the novel, Anderson felt that it did not stand a good chance of being published in Australia, taking it instead to London publishing houses. It was taken by Macmillan Publishers in London and by Scribner in New York. And although it was not a great commercial success, it received a good deal of positive critical feedback. Anderson modestly maintained that the novel was little more than a good start. A Question of Money, Anderson's second novel, A Question of Money, was never published. She maintained that this unpublished work merited publication and suggested that it had been rejected at a time when sex was new in writing and everything had to be strongly sexual or violent. Although she considered revising A Question of Money for publication in the 1980s, as a more established author, she did not, and the work remains unpublished. Following the disappointment of A Question of Money, Anderson returned temporarily to radio script writing. She adapted a number of great works, including several by Henry James and Charles Dickens, which she found to be very healing experience. The Last Man's Head. Anderson's second published novel, The Last Man's Head, published in 1970, centers on the appropriately named detective Alec Probyn and his struggle to resolve a murder, of which he suspects his brother-in-law, Robbie McIver, to be guilty. Probyn's efforts are frustrated by the complex structure of the dominant McIver family, which seeks to deal with Robbie internally. Detective novel becomes a psychological thriller when a tormented Probyn kills Robbie. Like An Ordinary Lunacy, The Last Man's Head features a number of female characters who test the limits of their social roles, if not outright rebelling against them. Although Macmillan Publishers in London immediately accepted the novel for publication, it was inappropriately typecast as a simple crime novel, a decision with which Anderson and critics disagreed. The Commandant, Anderson's third and favorite novel, was her only work of historical fiction. The Commandant, published in 1975, based on the story of the murder of the infamously brutal penal commandant, Captain Patrick Logan, which Anderson had initially heard recounted in her childhood. The story is given a new, partly feminist perspective in that it is centered on the experience of Logan's young sister-in-law, 17-year-old Frances O'Byrne. Letty, Logan's sister, travels from Ireland to Moreton Bay penal settlement in 1830 to visit her sister. Although Frances is an invented character, most of the other characters are, in fact, based on accounts of real people from Anderson's extensive primary research. She created Frances to give voice to her own narrative commentary. Anderson once playfully likened the Moreton Bay social climate to Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford. Susan Sheridan notes that the likeness is particularly true of the discord between the elegant gentility of the middle class and the cruelty of the penal colony. As was the case with Last Man's Head, Anderson and many critics felt that the publishers packaged The Commandant inappropriately, making it look like a Regency romance. She states in one interview that this was very disappointing. Design and presentation, those things really matter. Success and later novels. Anderson's second marriage ended in divorce in 1976. By this time, Anderson had established herself as a professional novelist. Tira Lira by the River. Her greatest mainstream success, however, was to come in 1978 with the publication of her fourth novel, Tira Lira by the River. The title is a quote from Tennyson's great ballad, The Lady of Shalott, which tells the tale of a female artist who meets a tragic end when she attempts to move beyond artistic isolation. The novel details the life of Nora Porteous, whose natural creativity is constrained by the fact that she herself doesn't know that she's an artist. She struggles through, trying to arrive at her art and never succeeding. After 30-odd years away, Nora, now elderly, returns to Brisbane, where she spent her childhood. The novel is essentially a personally commentated replay of the life, during which Nora recounts and reflects upon the events that have shaped the course of her life. Anderson chose to create a woman from a very specific era, born several decades before Anderson herself was alive. Nora would have lived through World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression, in a time and pace where artists, although they were known to exist, were supposed to exist elsewhere. Nora struggles to submerge her various artistic and unconventional selves in favor for a more socially acceptable, constructed persona. Nora uses the spinning globe, her equivalent of the Lady of Shalott's crystal mirror, to explore the various stages and facets of her life, and to conceal some of its more unsavory aspects from herself and from the reader. The novel began its life as a 20,000-word novella, which was prize-winning in its own right. As it was an awkward length for a novel, publishers requested that Anderson extend the story, which she did following a trip to London in 1974. In 1975, Tira Lira was broadcast as a radio play, and in 1977, Macmillan Publishers in Melbourne accepted it for publishing. In the year of its publication, Tira Lira won the Australian Natives Association Literary Award and the Miles Franklin Literary Award, Australia's most prestigious literary award. Anderson attributed its tremendous success, in some degree, to the fact that it is less complex. I think it's easier to read than most of my others. The Impersonators. Anderson's fifth novel, The Impersonators, published in 1980, won her the prestigious Miles Franklin Literary Award for the second time. The novel enjoyed further critical acclaim. In 1981, it won the Christina Stead Fiction Award at the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. Named the only daughter for a publication in the United States, the novel details Sylvia Foley's return to Australia after having lived in England for 20 years. Having come to the conclusion that worldly possessions and marriage are the main stumbling blocks to achieve freedom, Sylvia returns to find each of her Australian relatives bound by both constraints, making them impersonators. Stories from the Warm Zone and Sydney Stories. In 1987, Anderson published Stories from the Warm Zone and Sydney Stories. As the title suggests, the book is divided into two sections. The first details a number of anecdotes from Anderson's childhood involving her family, all of whom she gives false names, which has been described as her most poignant evocation of her childhood home. The second part, less obviously autobiographical, sketches various lives and relationships against a backdrop of urban Sydney. The book was well received and won the Age Book of the Year in 1987. Taking Shelter. In 1989, Anderson published her sixth novel, Taking Shelter. Set in Sydney in the winter of 1986, the novel's focus is 21-year-old Beth Jeames and her relationships. Overwhelmed by her 6 half-brothers, Beth travels to Sydney at the request of her cousin, Kiri. Although she is engaged to Miles Ligard, a 29-year-old lawyer, at the beginning of the novel, he eventually admits that he is gay, and Beth leaves him. Almost immediately, she meets and begins a relationship with Marcus Peary, whom she discovers she had met in Rome when they were both children. When Beth discovers that she is pregnant, she and Marcus settle into a house owned by Juliet McCracken, who calls herself Miles' spare-old godmother. In fact, Juliet performs the role of fairy godmother to a number of characters in the novel, including Beth and Marcus. Elaine Barry suggests that this, along with Anderson's use of coincidence, dreams, and a superficially happy ending, makes Taking Shelter almost a parody of popular romantic fiction. One of the Wattlebirds. One of the Wattlebirds, Anderson's seventh and final novel, was published in 1994. Set in Sydney, it details 3 days in the life of Cicely Ambrose. Although the novel is ostensibly set in the present, The final paragraph of the novel reveals that the 3-day sequence has been devised by Cicely as a means of coping with the fact that a year earlier her mother, Christine, had died of breast cancer, while Cicely had been away on holiday. Throughout the novel, Cicely attempts to resolve two quandaries. She does not understand why her mother did not tell her about the fatal illness and let her go overseas, refusing to let her family members call her back, even for the funeral, nor why Christine included the cruel stipulation in her will that Cecily must marry before she can inherit. In addition to its adept depiction of the intricacies of social and family life, one of the Wattlebirds speaks to the process of writing and creating as Cecily herself is a writer. On July 9, 2010, Anderson died in Sydney at the age of 93 following a stroke. She was survived by her daughter, Laura Jones, Laura's husband, Peter Jones, and their daughter, Olivia Farrell, starting too late. Anderson was by no means alone in her late emergence onto the literary stage. Geordie Williamson notes that several of Anderson's Australian female contemporaries, including Elizabeth Jolley, Olga Masters, and Amy Whitting, did not begin publishing until they had reached retirement age. He suggests that each of these women was constrained largely by material circumstances, including the demands of family and work, lack of financial independence, and indifferent publishing environment. When discussing her career, Anderson was quite clear about where her duties lay. When I was married and writing at home, writing was my second job. My first was the house. I never craved to be out in the workplace. He suggests that, as well as adverse material circumstances, Anderson's career was delayed, and her success mitigated by modesty and a certain diffidence regarding her gifts. In her own essay entitled Starting Too Late, Anderson complains that they are unwilling servants, those skills we learn too late. She would perhaps have described success as such a skill. When asked about how winning awards had affected her life, she replied that it's encouraging to win a prize, but the success of Tira Lira, plus the prize it won and the two prizes the impersonator won, made me feel less private and more vulnerable. And I had to get over that in order to go on at all. I had never been interviewed before, or I had never been asked to be interviewed, and suddenly I had all these interviews. It was a challenge I found hard to meet. I almost wished I had kept writing under a pseudonym as I had begun. In spite of her late start, Anderson's career as a novelist spanned 3 decades, during which she produced 8 critically acclaimed works. Of these, only Tira Lira by the River remains in print. A plaque commemorating Anderson's writing is included in the Sydney Writer's Walk. Bibliography, novels: An Ordinary Lunacy, 1963, The Last Man's Head, 1970, The Commandant, 1975, Tira Lira by the River, 1978, The Impersonators, 1980, published in the United States as The Only Daughter, Taking Shelter, 1989, One of the Wattlebirds, 1994. Short story collections: Stories from the Warm Zone and Sydney Stories, 1987. Radio plays: The American, 1966, adaptation of the novel by Henry James. The Ashburn Papers, 1967, adaptation of the novel by Henry James. The Maid's Part, 1967. Daisy Miller, 1968, adaptation of the novella by Henry James. A Tale of Two Cities, 1968, adaptation of the novel by Charles Dickens. The Blackmail Caper, 1972. Quite Sweet, Really, 1973. Tira Lira by the River, 1975. The Last Man's Head, 1983. If you guys are still here, thank you. It means a lot to me to have you stick through to the end. I am going to take some time now to talk about thoughts and plans for the future, as well as how I hope this series will evolve. Honestly, I wasn't expecting this video to take as long as it did. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed doing it. Since this was more audio focused, and I didn't focus as much on visual content, instead focusing on audio hiccups and the like, as it's probably painfully obvious, I'm not a prolific public speaker. However, I do hope that with practice, I will get better, and thus easier on the ears. I also hope to be able to add visuals such as images to the video for those who enjoy watching along with reading and hearing. Furthermore, I'd love to hear from you guys, especially if anyone is more knowledgeable on the subjects covered and they would love to stick it to Wikipedia or elaborate further on any details lacking. I'd love to see your feedback and interactions with my content. As for future content, I do hope to be able to do my own research content and in depth dives on topics that interest me. These will be more biased, of course, and include my own personal thoughts and takes. If you would be interested in that, then please stick around and maybe consider hitting the subscribe button. I may also sprinkle in gaming content, or maybe even react content where I give my own takes on videos and content. Really, I will be throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what people want, for however long it takes. At least until I hit my stride. Videos may not have a consistent drop to start off, due to priorities with work and all that, but I'm hoping to be able to get at least 1 or 2 videos out per week, if not every other week, depending on how long it takes to edit. So hit the notification bell to be notified of the next video. Thank you again for sticking around. I look forward to releasing the next video for you guys. See ya.